There's a lie they have been repeating to you since grade school, one that Hollywood has burned into your brain over decades. A lie so large, so well constructed, so universally accepted as absolute truth, that almost nobody stops to question it. And that lie goes like this: that ancient Egypt was a civilization of brutalized slaves building pyramids under the whip of a god pharaoh. That is false. And what actually happened is infinitely more fascinating, darker, richer, and more disturbing than any Hollywood film you have ever seen. Today we're going to dig up 5,000 years of secrets. The ones the textbooks never tell you. The ones museums prefer to leave out. The ones that completely change the image you have of the longest and most powerful civilization that has ever existed on the face of the earth. Subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. Every week we reconstruct with artificial intelligence eras that official history decided to tell you only half of. What you are about to see today about ancient Egypt, you will not find in any classroom. Let us start where nobody starts, with money. Because before talking about mummies, gods, and pyramids, you need to understand something fundamental. Egypt was not a religious civilization with some money on the side. It was a brutal, calculating, and ruthless economic machine that used religion as a tool of political and financial control. And the difference between those two things changes everything. The Nile River was literally the central bank of the entire civilization. Every year, between July and October, the Nile flooded and deposited along its banks an incredibly fertile layer of black silt that the Egyptians called Kemet, black land. And that was the reason Egypt could produce 3 harvests a year, while the rest of the ancient world produced 1 or none. In a world where 90% of humanity lived on the permanent edge of starvation, Egypt was a food factory, and the pharaoh was the absolute owner of that factory. Not figuratively, literally and legally. Every grain of wheat that grew in every corner of the country was, technically, the pharaoh's property. Every head of cattle, every tree, every gold mine, everything. The pharaoh was not the ruler of Egypt. He was Egypt. And here comes the first secret that almost nobody tells you. Egypt had no currency. Throughout its entire 3,000-year history, this civilization that built the largest structures the world has ever seen, that traded with Nubia, with Mesopotamia, with the shores of the Mediterranean, and with the distant lands of Punt south of Africa. This civilization functioned for most of its existence without a single coin, without a single cent, without a single piece of currency. The Egyptian economic system was regulated barter. Wages were paid in bread and beer. Not metaphorically. The average worker received 10 loaves of bread and a jug of beer as daily pay. Beer was not a luxury. It was part of the official state salary. And bread could be used to exchange for anything else you needed in the market. What makes this even more fascinating is that the Egyptian state had accountants. Hundreds of scribes whose only job was to record, measure, catalog, and redistribute everything that went in and out of the royal storehouses. There existed a figure that historians call the Shiryu, a kind of commercial agent in service of the temples and the palace, who carried out buying and selling transactions on behalf of state institutions. The first banking system in history was not invented by the Italians of the Renaissance. It was invented by the Egyptians 4,000 years earlier, using sacks of grain as reserve currency and temples as safety vaults. And speaking of temples, here is the second great secret. Egyptian temples were not simply places of worship. They were corporations. They were the most powerful business conglomerates of the ancient world. The Temple of Ammonius at Karnak, at the peak of its power during the New Kingdom, around the year 1100 BC, controlled more than 900,000 acres of agricultural land, 800,000 heads of cattle, 75 urban settlements, 46 shipyards, and 240,000 workers in its service. A single temple, and there were dozens of temples of that size distributed across the entire country. The priests of the Temple of Ammonius accumulated so much wealth and power that at a certain moment in Egyptian history, around 1070 BC, the high priest of Ammonius declared himself the ruler of the southern part of the country, splitting Egypt in two. It was not an armed revolution. It was a corporate takeover. The richest priest simply had more resources than the pharaoh. How much gold did Egypt actually have? The answer is that nobody knows for certain, but the records that have survived are enough to drop your jaw to the floor. The mines of the Eastern Desert, in Wadi Hammamat and in the Nubian region, produced quantities of gold that no other territory in the ancient world could match. Tutankhamun, who died at 19 after a minor and relatively unimportant reign, was buried with more than 5,000 objects of pure gold, including a funerary mask that weighs 11 kilos of solid gold. And Tutankhamun was, in historical terms, a second-tier pharaoh, a young man who died before doing anything memorable. The great pharaohs, the Ramesses, the Thutmoses, the Amenhoteps, accumulated riches that made Tutankhamun's tomb look modest. All those tombs were looted in antiquity. What Howard Carter found in 1922 was what remained after centuries of plundering. That gives you an idea of the scale of what once existed. But now comes the part one most want to tell you. The part that completely destroys the most famous myth about Egypt. The myth of the pyramids and the slaves. For 2,000 years, ever since the Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BC and wrote that the pyramids were built by 100,000 slaves, the entire world assumed that was the truth. Hollywood turned it into an industry. The film showed thousands of chained bodies dragging stones under the sun while overseers whipped them mercilessly. It was the perfect image of the Oriental tyrant. And it was, from start to finish, a fantasy. In 1990, Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass discovered, just a few meters from the pyramids of Giza, a cemetery that nobody expected to find. It was not the cemetery of the pharaohs. It was the cemetery of the workers. The tombs were modest, yes, but they were tombs, with funerary goods, with offerings, individual, well-constructed tombs for men who died doing brutal physical labor. And no pharaoh in the entire history of Egypt ever permitted a slave to be buried in the sacred ground of the pyramids. That was unthinkable. Slaves had no tomb. Slaves had no name carved in stone. And yet, there were those names. There were those tombs. A few years later, at the same site, an entire city appeared. Bakeries producing bread on an industrial scale. Storehouses full of dried fish and meat. Medical facilities with evidence of surgeries. Broken bones correctly reset. Amputations performed with surgical instruments. The Egyptian state was operating what, with all the weight that comes with saying it this way, was a health insurance system for its construction workers. People who lost a leg in a worksite accident were not simply discarded. They were operated on and rehabilitated. The first documented strike in the history of humanity occurred in Egypt, around the year 1170 BC. The workers of the village of Deir el-Medina, who were building the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, folded their arms and refused to work. The reason is recorded in the official government papyri. They had not received their beer ration. The workers building the royal tombs of ancient Egypt went on strike for not receiving their beer. That, more than anything else, tells you who these people were. Tell me in the comments, did you know that the first strike in history was in Egypt and it was over beer? Because that fact left me speechless the first time I read it. And if there is something in this story that is especially surprising you, tell me below. I love reading your responses, and many times you tell me facts I did not even know myself. And sometimes those comments become the next video on the channel. Now then, if you thought the contaminated canals and the Black Death were the darkest aspects of Venetian wealth, wait, because what comes now you are not going to see on any Discovery Channel documentary. Ancient Egypt was, without any doubt, the most sexually uninhibited civilization of the entire ancient world. And that is saying a lot in a world that included Greeks and Romans. The difference is that the Greeks and Romans were quite explicit and direct in their sexual representations. The Egyptians, on the other hand, encoded everything. They hid it in layers of religious symbolism that only the initiated could decipher. Their tombs, which today we visit as solemn museums of funerary art, were full of erotic messages completely invisible to the modern visitor who does not know the code. The Egyptian verb for to throw, for example, was phonetically identical to the verb for to engender. So a hunting scene in the papyri, a man throwing a javelin at a group of ducks, was at the same time, for the Egyptian who knew how to read it, an image of procreation and fertility. Ducks were a recognized erotic symbol in the Egyptian imagination. The servants who at funerary banquets pour wine into the guests' cups were, at the second level of reading of those images, performing an act of fertility. All Egyptian funerary art has this double layer. What you see on the surface is ritual decoration. What lies beneath is a deep, almost mystical obsession with the generation of life, with sexuality as a cosmic force that guarantees the continuity of existence. And then there is the erotic papyrus of Turin, a papyrus scroll from the Ramesside period, around 1150 BC, now preserved in the Egyptian Museum of Turin in Italy, which for decades researchers refused to exhibit publicly. The papyrus has two sections. One is satirical, with animals performing human activities, playing music, drinking wine. The other section is one of the most explicit sexual representations to have survived from the ancient world, with figures identifiable as members of the court and priesthood in a sequence of scenes that leaves nothing to the imagination. The most famous French Egyptologist of the 19th century, Jean-François Champollion, the very man who deciphered hieroglyphics using the Rosetta Stone, said upon seeing that papyrus that it produced in him a strange impression regarding Egyptian wisdom and composure. And Champollion was not exactly a prudish man. But the most striking dimension of Egyptian sexuality is not in that papyrus. It is in the cosmology, in the way the Egyptians explained the origin of the universe. The primordial god Adam, the one who existed before anything else existed, found himself alone in the original chaos. And to create the world, he masturbated. From his seed were born the first gods, Shu and Tefnut, who in turn engendered the rest of the pantheon and the physical world. The Nile River, that artery of life that made the entire civilization possible, was considered the manifestation of the god's seminal fluid. And once a year, the pharaoh himself performed a ceremony on the banks of the Nile in honor of that primordial myth, because the pharaoh was the god on earth, and the god had cosmological obligations to fulfill. The pharaohs, in order to preserve the purity of divine blood, practiced marriage between siblings with complete normality. Ramesses II, the most celebrated pharaoh in history, had at least 8 official wives, and it is estimated he had between 80 and 100 recognized children. Among his wives was his own sister, Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the woman who seduced Caesar and Mark Antony, had married 2 of her younger brothers before Rome entered her life. Incest among royalty was not a taboo or a shameful secret. It was a divine requirement. The gods had married each other. The pharaoh, who was a god, did the same. And there's one last secret I want you to take away from this video. One that has to do with wealth and with real power in Egypt. And that explains something historians took a long time to understand. In Egypt, for most of its history, the temples were richer than the state. And when the priests became too powerful, the pharaohs tried to destroy them. Akhenaten, the pharaoh who ruled between 1353 and 1336 BC, made one of the most radical decisions in ancient history. He declared that all the gods of the Egyptian pantheon were false except one, the solar disk Aten, and ordered all the temples closed, all their wealth confiscated, and the names of the other gods erased from every monument in the country. It was not a sincere religious conversion. It was a financial coup. Akhenaten tried to bankrupt the priests of Ammonius, who were literally richer than he was, and nationalize their assets. He failed. When he died, his successors erased his name from official history, demolished his sacred city, and returned all power and all wealth to the priests. The history that officially never happened was a pharaoh's attempt to carry out a tax reform. 5,000 years of secrets, a civilization that invented banking without currency, that built its greatest monuments with free workers who went on strike over their beer, that encoded sexuality into every corner of its funerary art, and that was ultimately destroyed not by foreign invaders, but by the debt accumulated over centuries of building ever larger temples for ever richer gods. The Egypt you know is a postcard. The real Egypt was a 3,000-year business. And like every great business, what happened behind closed doors was far more interesting than what they showed in public. If you made it this far, I want to know which of all these facts hit you hardest. Akhenaten trying to carry out a tax reform disguised as a religious revolution? The beer strike? The erotic papyrus of Turin? The sexual cosmology of the Egyptians? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely read every single one, and many times you bring me facts I did not know that end up becoming the next video. Share this with someone who thinks they already know everything about Egypt, because what you just saw today nobody else is going to teach you. See you in the next one.